and welcome to On Deadline. I'm Kendra Nichols.
I'm Amanda St. Hilaire.
And I'm Dennis Owens.
If you're listening for the very first time, where have you been? We are journalists for ABC27 News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
But on this podcast, we talk about issues that affect people all over.
These are the conversations you don't hear on the news. We're different generations, different experiences, so we don't always agree.
Which can be fun. We do get very personal, we get very real, and our goal here is always to get you and to get ourselves thinking.
So we're recording on February 19th, 2018. Of course, February marks Black History Month, a tribute to African-American men and women who have made significant contributions to America and really the rest of the world in fields like science, politics, law, and many, many fields. So in honor of Black History Month, ABC27 aired a special edition of Hidden History. We'll talk about those stories that we featured. Then, reporting sexual harassment at the Capitol. How often is it reported? And who investigates? You may be surprised. Amanda St. Hilaire will discuss her investigation. So let's get to our first topic. As I just said, ABC27 aired a special edition of Hidden History. ABC27 morning anchor James Crummel was part of that show, and he is joining us now. Hi, James.
Hi, Kendra.
It's good to have you back.
Good to be here.
It's been a while. You were a regular there for a while.
Where'd you go?
I'm still listening.
Yeah, right.
I can't
We're
just
going to
barge
quiz
in on
you about
guys.
all our past episodes to see if that's really true.
Okay, so the 2018 theme for Black History Month is actually African Americans in times of war, as this actually marks the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I and honors the roles that Black Americans have played in warfare from the American Revolution to present day. Now, James, your story kind of played into that theme because your story was dealing with the Underground Railroad. So tell us about the Mifflin House in York County.
Okay, so this is very interesting to me, just because there are so many. The title of the program is called Hidden History, and there are a lot of hidden gems right here in the Mid-State, dating back all the way hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And of course, the Underground Railroad was a major part of African American history. And what it was just a series of safe houses and locations where Black people tried to escape slavery. And they were headed north to do that. And there were many stops here in the Mid-State. And one of them is Mifflin House, and that's in Hellam Township, York County. And what happened there was it's a big house that sits on top of a hill. And this family, the Mifflins, who lived in that house, they had another person who would help them. What he did was he would ferry people across the Susquehanna River, and basically people were headed towards the Philadelphia area when they were headed north. And this house, the Mifflin House, is one place where they would stay in the road to do that. And it was a place for them to hide because at that time there were a lot of people who were after them. So there were slave catchers and there were bounty hunters and things like that. And their job was just to round them up and take them back. Mm-hmm. And this house was a place where they were able to hide, and then from there they could go right down the hill because the river is right there, and they would be ferried across the Susquehanna River into Lancaster County, and from there they would make their way towards Philadelphia. And speaking of the war, which you're saying, one of the things in the 1800s was a lot of African Americans wanted to fight in the Civil War, mm-hmm. and many of them weren't allowed, and they just wanted to fight for their country too, and Philadelphia played a major role in that as well, because a lot of the slaves who escaped to the North then went on to fight for the North. But even then, it really was a struggle to be able to fight for either side. Mm-hmm. But they managed because they needed the numbers and they needed the help. And the Mifflin House also played a role in the Civil War because, as I said before, it sits on top of a hill. And on the march to Gettysburg, that house played a big role because there was a battle right there. The house sits right near Wrightsville, and you know the Wrightsville Bridge. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many people had to cross that bridge to get there, and that house sat right on top of a hill that overlooked all of that, and they were able to see when the Confederates were coming, and they were able to battle them back.
And what they did was they set that bridge on fire so that the Southerners couldn't mm-hmm. cross the bridge and get access to Harrisburg. They burned
literally
the bridge
burning
down.
the
yes.
bridge.
Mm-hmm. And the legend is that it spread to the town, the fire did, from mm-hmm. the bridge, and that the Southern troops who had just been thwarted actually helped put the fire out.
Mm-hmm. And if you visit Wrightsville, they actually have like a little museum, and they have a replica of that bridge burning. It was very interesting just to hear and learn a little bit more about that too.
You made an interesting point. It must have been so frightening at the time, but it's amazing to me that it's just getting to the north wasn't enough, right? There was people that would actually come after you and try to grab you and take you back.
Well, and I think especially growing up in the north, through history, and whether this is the fault of textbooks or how things get twisted, we think of it as this shining beacon where, we were for equality and the South was bad. And when you hear about how even coming to the North, that there were problems if you wanted to fight for your country and you weren't necessarily safe, I think that's easy for us to forget. And your story was a really good reminder of that.
Yeah, it absolutely was not, okay, we've made it across the river, it's over. There were still many, many battles ahead, but it was definitely a very important stop.
So the big point of your story is the Mifflin House is in danger of being torn down.
Yeah. So what happened is the owners of that land, they have already built 2 warehouses on that land, and now they want to expand. And to do that, they want to tear down that house to make way for another warehouse there. So many people in the community, they've learned about this, and then they're trying to fight back. And so one of the people that I interviewed in my story, she was actually a descendant of the man that I was telling you about, who was helping to ferry the slaves across the Susquehanna River. She just happened to do some research and figured out that she is a direct descendant of that man. And now she's also taken on the cause to learn more about this house, because she's never had a chance to even go inside the house.
I remember her saying that. She's like, I just want to walk inside. I just want to go in there.
Well,
and see
you
it.
would think it would be clear cut. Okay, this has historical significance. We're not going to tear it down. But your story gets into the fact that historical preservation is a really complicated process.
It's very complicated. It's very lengthy as well. It's not something. So I talked to Preservation Pennsylvania, and what they do is they come out with a list of different places across the state that they consider at risk. And this is one of them. And what they do is they try to shed light on it and bring attention to it and try to help any way that they can. So right now, this fight is in court. So they had a zoning board meeting, and the woman that I was telling you about, she actually went there and she spoke about the house and how she wants to visit it. And the zoning board ended up agreeing with her, and they said, okay, well, you can't tear down the house. And it was basically a technicality that they can't do that right now. So the developers have moved that on, and now it's in county court, and
so
they're still waiting.
Time.
They're still waiting to hear from that judge, and of course,
so there's still time, but they haven't given up on the attempt.
They haven't. And the problem, of course, is, when you're dealing with companies and you're trying to fight them in court, well,
resources.
Exactly. And as you continue going along the court process, well, then, you start to run out of money.
Well, and on the other side, we don't have enough warehouses in this area. So perhaps we need another one. No, but there's a very serious issue on this historic preservation is you can't save every single building in this part of the country has some sort of historic significance. You cannot save them all.
Right. The founding fathers sneezed here once.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what they look at is, okay, so if we save it, what are you going to do with it after we save it? Are you of a means to keep it up, to take care of it? And so that all factors into that as well. And it's not an easy decision.
And in this case, it's not someone sneezing once. It seems like there's a strong case for true historical significance.
And it's really interesting, too, because if you saw the story, the house pretty much still looks the same today as it did back then. The house has been kept up very well.
It does look really nice.
It looks really nice. So the hope would be, if they were able to save it, that they would then be able to turn that over to someone who could continue that and maybe turn that into some type of museum or something that people could come and take a look at it and visit it.
Why is it so important that we remember these parts of our history? I know there are going to be some people who say, okay, cool, it's an old building, we can put it on a plaque somewhere. Right. Why bring all this up?
Why still have the building? Right.
And I think definitely, so I talked to a historian in the story as well, and I think he brought up an excellent point. When it's one thing to read about history, it's another to be able to physically touch it. And that's the whole point of museums. And if you go and you can actually see where something happened, and the fact that this is right in our own backyard, and I had never heard about this until I did the story on it, and it's right there, and being able just to see it and breathe it and touch it. And the fact that this was just 150 years ago. This was not something in the ancient past.
Right.
This is something
In the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, no,
exactly.
right.
It's something that is a part. And again, and I always go back to this when we say that this is Black History Month, and it is. But this is a part of all of our history. This is not just something that should be seen because it's a part of Black history. This is a part of everybody's history.
On that vein, I know I've seen stories in the past in my time here that there have been a number of homes in our area that were used in the Underground Railroad. What can you is that true? And are there many others around here like that?
Yeah, there are many places in this area that have been stops on the Underground Railroad, and it's funny because listening to some of the stories about people coming from the South and making their way here. So for many people, they thought when they crossed the Susquehanna River, it took them so long to get here. They crossed the Susquehanna River. Many of them thought they were in Canada. That's how far north that they thought that they got. And it's just, part of it was just the hope that, that they made it, and just the length of time that it took. And just to think that they were able to get this far north with the help of lots of different people. And of course, it wasn't just, it wasn't just Black people. White people were helping them along the way as well.
And also endangering themselves, I imagine, at some point. Now, did the traveling only happen at night, or how did that work?
It happened all the time, but of course, nighttime was the best way to go without being detected.
Seen, right.
But, it was very dangerous, especially crossing a river at night. And having someone being able to help you do that.
And the Susquehanna is not small. It's
Yeah.
Right.
When
and especially, depending on what time of year you're talking about, it's not safe.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, I thought it was a really interesting story, and we should mention Val also did a story on the Edgemont Fire Company. It was the first African American fire company, coming up on 100 years, I believe.
Yes.
So that was another interesting little hidden history here.
Yeah, and volunteer fire department,
Right.
African American volunteer fire department, and the legacy still continues on today. So definitely lots of history right here in our area.
I think that's the cool thing about history is we drive by buildings all the time and we don't know.
Yeah, you can grow up here.
So this is why I love this series that we do, where we focus on local things, that the little little facts that you didn't know. I find that stuff so interesting.
And we got a lot of people sent us emails and called us saying, wow, your Hidden History special was great. I didn't know that existed. So there was a strong reaction from the public to this as well. There's always one email.
Well, yeah.
And in this case, and of course I'm going to bring it up because I'm me. So we did get an email, and I won't read it word for word because some parts of it have some interesting language in it. But
okay.
It was someone who, the gist of it is this person was offended, asking when we were going to celebrate White History Month, saying we were racist for doing a special about Black history in our area, or as James, as you say, all of our history. What's your response when you get reactions like that, especially given all the time and effort that we've all put into these stories about what has shaped us into who we are today?
Right. So my reaction to that is first of all, when are we going to celebrate White History Month? For many people and many children in schools, that's every other day of the year.
The other 11 months of the year.
If you take a look at some of the textbooks, this stuff isn't in it. And it's important to have a wide range of history, but many of our textbooks are outdated. And I know I grew up in this area. I went to school in this area, and there were many sections of our history, including Black history, that was not in those textbooks. And I think it is important for, again, not just little Black children, but all children to know what this country's history is and what happened.
And to see yourself represented.
Absolutely.
And I was just going to say, I'm fascinated at history, and these are history things that I didn't know about. So regardless of the color, so this person, it's a history lesson.
Right.
Period.
And absolutely. When I was out there working on this story, and I was fascinated just by having this piece of history here in our backyard. I didn't walk through saying, wow, you know what? This is kind of history, but it's Black history. No, this is history.
Right.
And it's something that, this story didn't have to be told in this month. It could be told in any month, just like anything else.
Right. It's just we take this month to make sure we are focusing on efforts on telling all of our history so that we're well-rounded maybe for the rest of the year. That's how I've always seen it.
Absolutely. I agree.
And just to touch on, like, some people are like, it's just buildings, but you could say that about the battlefield. It was just a battlefield, or it was just, but when you're there and you can see it and you can imagine the people that were there, and I know the battlefield is a little different because people lost their lives there, but if you can go and touch this home.
People lost their lives here too.
That's true. Then you can imagine, that's how I am. When I go to these places, I'm like, did they come in this store? Did they, that's the kind of stuff. And if you erase all of that, it's not, I mean, it doesn't help the future to understand the past or relate to it.
One of the things I asked the executive director of Preservation Pennsylvania, I asked her about, those blue signs, those historic signs across the state. And I said, is there a chance that you could get one of those put up at this house? And she said, yes, that is a possibility. But when you put one of those signs up, that's usually a spot where something used to be. That's a sign that nothing is there anymore for you to actually see. Yeah. And again, I do think that it is important to actually see some of these things. It just makes it that much more impactful.
You just touched on some people lost their lives there. So did the locals at the time, that is neighbors, if there are any neighbors or people in the area, know that this house was being used for that? And what was their reaction? Were they supportive?
I don't think that. Well, the whole point was for people not to know that this was there. So you didn't want to have a whole community knowing something was going on there, because the more people would know, obviously, the easier it is to be found out. So I think that this was happening under a lot of people's noses. But I will say that the people who live there right now who are finding out about this, it's very fascinating to me because, again, as we were talking about Black history and why does this matter? So there are people in the community who are fighting to save this, and they are not just Black people who are fighting to save this house. There are people in that community. And I was just doing the story, and I was just standing in a neighborhood. I wasn't going to ask anyone anything. It's private property where the house sits. So I had to go stand in another neighborhood to be able to look at the house. And people would come out and ask me what I was doing there. They saw the cameras. And when I told them the story that I was telling, they were like, oh, yeah, I love that house. I don't want them tearing that down. I heard about that this was here, and I heard what the historical responsibility was for this. And I want it to stay. So please get this story out.
So people wanted to talk to you. We don't always get that in this business.
People just came out of their houses and told me about this. I didn't even go to ask them anything.
I'm thinking especially Amanda and Kendra don't exactly get a good reaction when they're
James
showing
Crummel,
up.
though, people flock to him.
Oh my gosh. It's true.
Let's not feed his ego.
I know.
Too late.
Well, James, thanks so much for coming on and sharing the story. Is this something that you do often, the Hidden History? I know you have different assignments, but is this one that you do monthly, weekly?
So this is the second time we've done it. We've done a half-hour special every starting last February, and then we did it again this February. And the response has been pretty good for it. So I'm hopeful that we'll get to do another one pretty soon.
All right, so let's get to our next topic. Sexual harassment. Has that been in the headlines lately? Yeah. So, Amanda, you did a story. As soon as all of the Me Too movement started going, we started questioning what happens here. How does the Capitol handle things like this?
Yes.
So you started investigating and found out some interesting things.
I did. Can I start with a public service announcement? If you are an elected leader, or if you get paid with taxpayer dollars, and you decline an interview, or if you don't answer calls about an interview, about how you're using those resources, it doesn't mean the interview isn't going to happen. It means that you're giving up say in when and where the interview happened. And that plays into this story that we did, because we had a really hard time getting answers to really basic questions, in my opinion. So it started where we just said, okay, what are the policies for reporting sexual harassment at the Capitol? We had heard from people saying the culture in place, the policies, the practices really discourage people from filing complaints in the first place. And we got the policies via right to know requests. And the policies are different for House Republicans versus House Democrats. There is one policy for the Senate, but the Democrats then have their own separate directive. And then that's different from what governs the state agencies and everything under the executive branch. So they all define harassment differently. They all define discrimination differently. So, for example, if you are a House Republican, you are protected from discrimination based on your veteran status. If you are a House Democrat, you're not protected based on veteran status, but you are protected based on gender identity. But the House Republicans don't protect you based on gender identity. So what happens if a House Democrat harasses a House Republican?
Oh, boy.
Yeah, no one could really answer that question. But the most interesting part is that in the House Republicans and then both parties in the Senate, party leadership, so your House Republican leader, your
Speaker of the House, Majority Leader.
Well, yeah, the majority and minority leaders, and then the Senate President pro tem, they have power to outright dismiss a harassment complaint against a fellow lawmaker, or determine the scope of the investigation or decide how far it gets. So, if your party leadership and someone on your team is accused, gee, I wonder if you would have incentive to say, maybe we make that go away. That was the complaint we were getting from the Capitol. So then we wanted to know, okay, how many complaints have been filed?
This is the part that got me. Honestly.
Yeah.
I was like, what's the deal here?
How many complaints have been filed? How many lawsuits have been going on? Who exactly has been trained with sexual harassment training? And how often has that training happened? We filed those requests, and those requests were denied in the House and in the Senate. The House, I believe it was the House, actually tried to argue. I had requested the budget for sexual harassment training. They tried to argue that a budget was not a financial record, so it should not be disclosed.
You mean
under
a budget's
the right
a
to know
financial
law.
record?
I was like, riddle me that. I wonder why we're having financial issues at the Capitol.
No wonder they can't get one done on time.
They can't agree what it is.
But they wouldn't even tell you how many
complaints. I did not ask who the complaints were filed against. I did not ask who filed the complaints.
So they refused
I just
to even
wanted
give you
to
a
know.
number.
Correct. Now, here's the, Dennis, your favorite phrase, sticky wicket. Pennsylvania's right to know law. Lawmakers passed it about 10 years ago. When they passed it, they carved out their own special rules for themselves. So every other state government agency, there's a wide variety of records they have to turn over, including, but not limited to, emails, text messages, even Facebook messages off your personal account. Lawmakers, it's a very limited scope of records. So you'd be hard pressed to get their emails. It's different under the executive branch.
They protected themselves.
Right. The lawmakers. Now, the governor's office, they still have to turn over the stuff the other government agencies do.
And if you refute it, there's an Office of Open Records that you appeal to, like a third party.
With every other government agency, if Silver Spring Township denies my right to know request, I can appeal it, and the Office of Open Records, a neutral third party, will decide, okay, does this appeal have grounds? Do they need to grant it? So on and so forth. Not so in the House and Senate. Mm-hmm. If they deny your request, you appeal to someone who works for the House or Senate. So you're appealing.
You're basically appealing to the same person who just rejected.
Yeah, not to the same person, but certainly to the same agency.
Right.
Now, there have been times when...
Oh, but I would argue in the Senate it's virtually the same person because you know they're having a conversation about it.
To be fair, there have been times when they've overturned the previous decision. So it's not that it's always going to be upheld.
Unfortunately, I've not seen one of those
times. I
I
have some of that. They're very interesting cases. So it wasn't a huge shocker when the House denied our appeal, because obviously we appealed when they denied us. The Senate is pending. So then we wanted to get answers from party leadership, because they're the ones who have this power to determine the scope of investigations. Why are these policies different? So we called... Several times. We called the offices of Republican leader Dave Reed in the House, House Democratic leader Frank Dermody, Senate Republican leader Jake Corman, Senate Democratic leader Jay Costa.
I'm impressed. You just nailed all four of those. Well
and then
done.
Senate President Pro Tem Joe Scarnati. In some cases, they outright declined an interview. In some cases, they started to call us back and then stopped. They ghosted us, as the kids are saying these days when it comes to dating.
What does that mean, by the way?
Just stop calling.
Yeah.
Stop
like
calling.
if you're dating someone and they just
them.
stop responding, that's ghosting.
Like when you text Amanda and I and we just don't respond to you, that's we're ghosting you.
Yeah, state lawmakers are like bad boyfriends.
But I know I'll see you here. I know I'll see you right here every week.
It's like something you would ever do, Kendra.
So we decided that we were going to show up and we were going to go to some of their press conferences about other things and ask those questions. Now, to be fair, when Joe Scarnati walked away from us, he never answered our questions. Dave Reed, Jake Corman, and Jay Costa did answer our questions. And when we got them on camera, they had very interesting information and thoughtful responses. Frank Dermody, he wasn't at any of those press conferences. We couldn't get him on camera, and his spokesperson declined an interview saying there was nothing to add. So that was disappointing. But the process of getting that information is hard. And even for other lawmakers.
Okay.
And that's the part that it feeds into that culture, according to the staffers and the lawmakers we're talking to, that can discourage someone from filing a complaint.
Right. More interesting to me than the fact that they made you jump through hoops and didn't cooperate
that's
is the
part of the
fact that
job.
it's wholly inadequate. And that's probably why you had to jump through hoops, is that I think somebody, now that the Me Too and Time's Up movements have really come to the fore, are recognizing we need to totally reevaluate what we're doing.
Yeah, I don't blame. They didn't write the current. As far as we know, they didn't have anything to do with the current policy. So I don't blame them for that. But this, with everything that's going on, they need to respond, and they need to say, like, it's time for a change. And why aren't they helping you get that information? That's my question.
An excellent question. So Dave Reed, the Republican House leader, said that they've been looking at putting one set of policies for the Republican caucus and the Democratic caucus, because he said, it shouldn't matter what party you are, the policies and procedures are the policies and procedures. The Senate is taking another look at their policies and how they do this. The interesting thing, though, is whether the practice of how they handle these complaints matches up to the policies. And since they won't release the records about that, we have no way of knowing that. I know that one argument I get from lawmakers is, well, we don't really have any complaints, so that's why we can't give you those records. But if there are no complaints, then that doesn't necessarily mean everything's hunky-dory at the Capitol. It could be, and maybe it is, but it could be that it's because people are discouraged from filing complaints in the first place. And that's where you have to get really careful about those numbers.
If I was a lawmaker, I'd want to know the answers to those questions.
Correct.
Especially in the current climate. What can we do to make it better? What's happening here?
So we interviewed House Rep Leanne Kruger-Branicki, and she's had a hard time getting answers to these questions as a lawmaker. And she introduced a bill that would establish an independent commission. Her bill would do several things, but it would in part establish an independent commission to investigate these complaints. Now, some will argue nothing at the Capitol is truly apolitical, so who's on this independent commission? And they could always have an agenda as well. But she said it's better than what we got. But she spoke to the culture at the Capitol. She had a pretty powerful soundbite where she talked about how a now retired state lawmaker, as she put it, stumbled onto the House floor during her first term, looked at her and said, back in the good old days, we didn't have to be nice to the secretaries. And that wasn't that long ago that happened. So she said, this is the culture we're up against. And so a lot of that resistance she attributes to the current climate. Whether that will change, time will tell.
And I can tell you, I've spoken with numerous people who say there's a problem, but they fear for their job. They need their job, or they don't want to be the face of dissent. Mm-hmm. But that point alone should make the powers that be, to Kendra's point, want to change the system or make sure there's a uniform system.
Right. Why not at least make the numbers public? Mm-hmm. And that's even what I talked to party leadership about, because they pointed to, when you file a right to know request with the House and Senate, not to get too deep into the weeds here, but let's face it, that's where I like to be. It goes to the chief clerk's office. So party leadership put it back on the chief clerk's office. So I asked them, well, do you think these should be public? Would you be willing to make these public? And most of them said they'd have no problem with that information being public. So if that's the case, then why are the chief
clerks are selected by party leadership? Just
exactly,
so you know.
Exactly. So if that's the case, then why isn't that happening? The right to know law doesn't prevent you from making a record public. It just gives you the power to not make it public. Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't be setting up a weird precedent by making it public, because the right to know law gives you that discretion. So from a legal perspective, that's not really an argument. So we're still fighting for those records.
Just from the outside looking in at all of this, I would think that this is something that people would want to know, because they want to know who they're voting into office and what these people are doing once they're there. Mm-hmm. And the fact that everything is so hidden from them, I think, is a big problem.
Well, and then you get into then the question of due process, because there are calls for, don't just release the number of complaints. We want to know who has had complaints filed against them, because there are lawmakers. These investigations take taxpayer resources. If there's a repeat offender, we should know. That gets into the really interesting debate about
if it's unfounded,
right to
is
know
it fair?
Versus your right to privacy.
Right.
And for all government agencies, many personnel and disciplinary records are exempt from the right to know law to protect that and to protect someone's right to due process, because there could be a false accusation. Right. And so how do you weigh that? Because on one hand, I want to know how my taxpayer resources are being used, and I want to know if my lawmaker is a quote repeat offender. But they have rights, and how do you figure out the give and take?
I don't think releasing a number is going to affect somebody. Yeah,
right.
You can tell us how many.
But the only way for that to change for the right to know law is if lawmakers pass it and basically close the provisions that protect them from disclosing many records. So raise your hand if you think that's going to happen anytime soon.
No hands went up.
Yeah. Well, James, we were going to change the investigator slogan to, if you hang up, we show up. Because we've had people that just don't get back to us, and then we're just forced to go. We're like, if we're going to call you, we need a comment,
I like it.
All right. Well, you'll keep us posted on what's next?
Absolutely.
All right. And James, thanks again for being on today.
Thank you for having me.
We always enjoy your company.
I enjoyed being here.
All right, if you'd like to check out the links to the stories, articles, and videos we discussed, you can find them in our show notes on our website, ABC27.com. To get On Deadline delivered directly to your phone, tablet, or computer each week, subscribe in iTunes or Google Play Music. Record your thoughts, questions, and suggestions about episodes and voice memos on your phone and email them to us at theinvestigators@ABC27.com. Please take a few minutes and leave us a review in iTunes. It helps our podcast reach other people and helps us figure out what we can improve on.
James, where's your review?
It's pending.
It's pending.
He has an opinion on
my
everything.
Right to know appeals.
Exactly.
Get on that, James. I'll show up. I'll demand answers.
Thank you to Eric Semmel for producing this podcast, and Jason Dees for composing and recording the music. It is time for us to go. We are on deadline.